The Aristotelian paradigm was incredibly successful. If you think that Aristotle put this thing together well before the time of Christ, and that as a scientific and a philosophical paradigm, it worked all the way into the time of Galileo, you can really think how strong and how powerful it was. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because the Aristotelian paradigm explains the world as we see it every day. We observe, we use our God-given logic, as Aquinas would say, we check with the people behind us, right? And then we can make some sort of good conclusion. So the idea here is that we can use that paradigm, we can use those questions that we've gone over more than once as a way to study and to understand absolutely everything in the world. But underlying all of that is the Aristotelian idea about time. Because without that underpinning of how Aristotle and the Aristotelian scientists or philosophers understood time, nothing else really works in the Aristotelian paradigm. So let's finish up this section asking the 4 questions that we've mentioned to Aristotelian science. First, what is the structure of time? Well, we know that Aristotle defined time for us. Aristotle said time is the counting of the before and the after. He said it more eloquently than I can, but that's basically it. Time is the counting of before and after. So time is rolling along in lots of befores and afters. Time equals change. So then, can humans predict the future? There's a way in which probably Aristotle himself and other Aristotelians would not really have asked that question quite that way. Because remember, they were interested in the past. They understood that people in the past were smarter than people in the present, that we had actually forgotten things as time moved on in a linear way. Nonetheless, he would say you can learn things and you can add to knowledge, and then the people that come after you should know something that you knew too. So there's a way in which you might be able to predict a little bit. You can see how things work in patterns. If you understand how the sun moves across the sky, you watch that for a few hundred years, you can figure out pretty much how it's going to work. So there are very small ways that you can predict, but only in the most general sense. And often those predictions were wrong. The next question is, can you control the future? Again, not so much. Now, remember, though, that there are people who are Aristotelian who would disagree with this. If you were a Christian and Aristotelian, if you were a Muslim and Aristotelian, you would have a different way of answering this question. But in terms of just the Aristotelian logic, I think you'd have to say that in most cases, no, you can't control the future unless you have some sort of direct line with God. If you're a prophet, then you might be able to predict and control. But in general terms, no. The last question, do human beings experience time externally, internally, or both? It seems to me that mostly time is external to us, in that things are changing. Before, after, before, after, before, after. History is moving along, right? Because history is simply change over time. But there is a little bit of an ontological aspect to this, isn't there? There's a little bit of an internal aspect to it because, as Aristotle says, time is the counting of the before and after. So you need somebody to count. You need a counter in order to be able to notice the change, to note that change, to count that change. So there is something slightly internal about it in that we are the people who are counting the change. However, time moves along, the changes happen without us being able to control them generally. And so I'd have to say that mostly humans would have to experience time in an external way. Importantly, though, Aristotle and the Aristotelians tend to look backwards in time. They tend to look for truth in the past, in the same way that Plato and the Platonic philosophers look for truth outside of time. What we'll see in the next segment is how people begin to think about time in the present and finding answers in the present and the future. That comes up next.